Number 1. Christopher Lee Watts, the man who hid a double life behind a perfect family. There are cases in the history of American true crime that manage to cut through the noise of a 24-hour news cycle and truly stop a nation in its tracks. And the case of Christopher Lee Watts, which came to light in the summer of 2018 from the quiet suburban town of Frederick, Colorado, is without question one of those cases, a story so profoundly unsettling not because of its complexity but because of its chilling simplicity. A man who appeared to the outside world as a devoted husband, a loving father, and a reliable neighbor turned out to be living an entirely different reality beneath the carefully constructed surface of his everyday life. And what he chose to do on the morning of August 13, 2018, would shatter not only his community but would prompt millions of people across the world to ask themselves how well they truly know the people closest to them. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985 in Spring Lake, North Carolina, and from the earliest years of his life he was described by those who knew him as a quiet, reserved, and deeply people-pleasing individual, someone who went out of his way to avoid conflict at almost any cost and who measured his own worth almost entirely through the approval of those around him. His relationship with his father Ronnie was warm and close, while his dynamic with his mother Cindy was more emotionally distant, and those who have analyzed his psychology in depth suggest that this early environment instilled in him a fundamental inability to express his true feelings directly, a pattern that would define his behavior throughout his adult life in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic. As a young man, Chris developed a passion for mechanics and automobiles, attending the NASCAR Technical Institute in Mooresville, North Carolina, where he earned a scholarship after placing third in a statewide competition hosted by the Automobile Dealers Association in 2003. A detail that speaks to a young man who, on the surface at least, was driven, capable, and heading toward a stable future. It was in North Carolina that the trajectory of his personal life would be permanently altered when, in 2010, he connected through Facebook with a woman named Shannon Rzusek, a vivacious, warm, and deeply ambitious young woman who had endured her own considerable personal struggles, including a battle with lupus and the emotional difficulty of a previous failed relationship, and who described meeting Chris as a turning point that had helped lift her out of one of the darkest periods of her life. Shannon was, by all accounts, a force of nature, energetic, charismatic, deeply devoted to her family, and possessed of an entrepreneurial spirit that she channeled into her work as a brand promoter for Lavelle, a health and wellness company whose flagship product was called Thrive. She documented her life extensively on social media, sharing everything from family dinners and her daughter's milestones to her business successes and her profound love for what she described as her perfect family. And to the hundreds of thousands of people who followed her online presence, Shannon Watts represented the best version of the American dream. A beautiful home, a loving husband, 2 adorable daughters, and a thriving career built entirely on her own terms. Chris and Shannon were married on November 3, 2012, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and they soon relocated to Frederick, Colorado, a small and peaceful community located northeast of Denver, where Chris had secured employment with Anadarko Petroleum, an oil and gas company where he worked as a field operator. In Colorado, the family put down roots quickly, purchasing a home valued at approximately $400,000, and together they welcomed their first daughter, Bella Marie Watts, born on December 17, 2013, and their second daughter, Celeste Catherine Watts, known affectionately as Cece, born on July 17, 2015. To everyone watching from the outside, the Watts family appeared to be exactly what Sean and presented them as: a genuinely happy, deeply bonded unit moving steadily forward together. But beneath that image, a very different reality was taking shape, one that neither Shanann's friends, her family, nor her hundreds of thousands of social media followers had any way of seeing. The family had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2015, carrying a debt of approximately $44,800, a financial strain that weighed quietly on the household even as Shanann's social media presence continued to project abundance and success. Chris, for his part, had always been someone who bottled his feelings rather than expressing them, and as the years passed, those unexpressed emotions began to create a growing distance between husband and wife. A distance that Sean and herself had begun to notice and worry about deeply in the months leading up to the summer of 2018. In the spring of that same year, the family received what should have been joyful news. Shanann was pregnant again, this time with a boy whom the couple planned to name Nico Lee. She shared the pregnancy reveal on social media in June, capturing on video the moment she told Chris by wearing a shirt that read, "Oops, we did it again," to which he replied with what appeared to be genuine excitement. But privately, according to text messages later recovered by investigators, Chris had already told Sean and that he was scared to death about a third child and that he was happy with just Bella and Cece. A confession that Sean and shared with a close friend in early August, adding that she was increasingly worried about the state of her marriage. What Sean and did not yet know, and what the investigation would later reveal in devastating detail, was that in June of 2018, while Sean Ann was on an extended visit with her family in North Carolina, Chris Watts had begun a secret romantic relationship with a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum named Nicole Kessinger. Chris had met Kessinger when he brought a broken gas meter to her office, and over the following weeks their professional interaction had shifted into something far more serious. According to Kessinger's own account to investigators, she had seen a photo of Sean and on Chris's phone and had known he was married, a detail that Chris would later both confirm and dispute in different versions of his prison interview. What is not in dispute is that by midsummer of 2018, Chris Watts was deeply emotionally invested in his relationship with Nicole Kessinger. Having taken her on an overnight trip to the Great Sand Dunes National Park over the 4th of July holiday, purchased a necklace for her, and begun planning what he described to her as an impending divorce from Sean Ann. He told Kessinger that his marriage was already over, that Sean Ann would not listen to him and spoke poorly of him in front of the children, and critically, he never disclosed to Kessinger that Sean Ann was 15 weeks pregnant with his child. Meanwhile, Sean Ann was attending a work leadership conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, in early August, trying to focus on her professional goals even as her closest friends noticed she was not herself, that her heart and mind were elsewhere, consumed by a growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong in her marriage. On the morning of August 7th, while still in Arizona, she sent a text message to a friend saying that Chris had admitted he was scared about the third baby and did not want another child. And friends who spoke with her in those final days described a woman who was deeply troubled, who loved her husband and was desperately trying to understand what was happening between them. Sean Ann returned home to Frederick on the night of August 12th, having been dropped off by her friend and fellow Thrive promoter Nicole Atkinson after their flight from Arizona. The two women embraced outside the house, and Atkinson later told investigators that she watched Sean Ann carry her suitcase into the home and close the door behind her. The last time anyone outside the Watts household would see Sean Ann Watts alive. What happened inside that home in the hours that followed would not become fully known until Chris provided a detailed confession to investigators at his Wisconsin prison in February 2019, and what he described was a marriage that had reached a point of complete emotional collapse. According to his own account, after a period of intimacy in the early morning hours of August 13th, he and Sean Ann began to talk, and he told her that he no longer loved her and that he wanted a separation. Sean Ann, who had grown to suspect that he was involved with another woman, confronted him directly, and in the confrontation that followed she told him that if they separated, he would never see his children again. Those words, Chris later told investigators, triggered something within him, and in the moments that followed, he made a decision that would destroy 4 lives and send shockwaves across an entire nation. Sean Ann Watts was 34 years old. She was 15 weeks pregnant with their son Nico. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. When Nicole Atkinson arrived at the Watts home the following morning after being unable to reach Sean Ann by phone, a total departure from Shanann's clockwork communication habits, she immediately sensed something was deeply wrong. She contacted Frederick police, who arrived at the residence and found Chris Watts calmly completing routine household tasks. He invited officers inside and told them he had no idea where his wife and daughters were, and in the hours that followed he appeared in a television interview on local news, making an emotional on-camera plea for the return of his family while exhibiting behavioral patterns. Speaking about Sean Ann in the past tense, displaying inappropriate composure, showing an absence of the distress one would expect, that immediately drew the attention of trained investigators. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation dispatched Special Agent Tammy Lee, and when Chris submitted to a polygraph examination on August 15th, the results were unequivocal. He scored a -18 on the deception scale, far beyond the threshold of -4 that indicated deception. When confronted with those results during the interrogation that followed, Chris's composure finally broke. He initially told investigators a version of events in which he blamed Sean Ann for the deaths of the girls, claiming he had acted in response to witnessing her harm their daughters, a claim that investigators immediately recognized as false and that Chris himself would later fully retract. With the truth closing in on every side, Chris Watts led officers to a remote oil field owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where the worst fears of everyone searching were confirmed. Shanann's body was recovered from a shallow grave, and the bodies of Bella and Celeste were found inside 2 of the oil storage tanks on the property. Chris Watts was taken into custody and formally charged with 9 criminal counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 additional counts of murdering a child, 1 count of the unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the life of unborn Nico Lee, and 3 counts of tampering with the remains of a deceased person. In the weeks that followed, investigators pulled back the curtain on the full scope of what Chris Watts had been doing in the months before August 13th. The affair with Nicole Kessinger, the secret planning, the emotional detachment from his family, the deliberate construction of a false persona, and what emerged was the portrait of a man who had chosen to eliminate the people who depended on him most rather than face the discomfort of an honest conversation. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts appeared in Weld County Court and entered a guilty plea on all 9 charges. The death penalty, which prosecutors had initially been prepared to seek, was taken off the table at the request of Shanann's family, who wished to avoid a lengthy and re-traumatizing trial. On November 19, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow delivered his sentence, describing the crime as perhaps the most inhumane and vicious he had encountered in thousands of cases presided over during his legal career, and he handed down 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 84 years for the remaining charges. In February 2019, investigators traveled to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, where Chris was being held, and conducted a 5-hour recorded interview in which he provided his first full and complete account of everything that had occurred. He admitted that his affair with Nicole Kessinger had consumed him completely, that he had come to view his wife and daughters as obstacles rather than as the family he had sworn to protect, and in one of the most chilling admissions in the entire case, he told investigators that in the immediate aftermath of what had happened, he had felt not grief but relief, a statement that encapsulates with terrible clarity the depth of his moral collapse. Chris Watts remains incarcerated at a maximum security facility in Wisconsin to this day, serving 5 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of ever leaving prison. Sean and Watts's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, have channeled their grief into advocacy for domestic violence awareness. In 2019, a civil court awarded the Rzusek family $6 million in a wrongful death judgment against Chris Watts, a judgment that will almost certainly never be collected given his incarceration, but that stands as a formal legal acknowledgement of the magnitude of what he took from the world. Bella Marie Watts, Celeste Catherine Watts, Nico Lee Watts, who never drew a single breath, and Sean and Catherine Watts, who loved her family openly and completely, who built her life around the people she trusted most, and who deserved infinitely better than the fate she was given by the man she had chosen to spend her life with. Number 2, Scott Lee Peterson, the man who smiled while the world searched for his wife. There are criminal cases that become cultural touchstones, cases that stop an entire nation and force millions of ordinary people to confront deeply uncomfortable truths about trust, deception, and the hidden lives that people sometimes lead behind the closed doors of their own homes, and the case of Scott Lee Peterson, which began on Christmas Eve of 2002 in the quiet central California city of Modesto, is without question one of the defining true crime stories of the early 21st century, a case that captivated the American public for more than 2 years, and that continues to generate debate, documentaries, and deeply divided opinion to this day. Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, and by all outward appearances he was the kind of young man that parents hoped their daughters would bring home, handsome, charming, well-spoken, and possessed of an easy confidence that made him immediately likable in almost any social situation. He met a young woman named Lacey Denise Rocha while they were both students at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, and from the earliest days of their relationship, those around them described Lacey as radiant, warm, generous, and deeply in love with the man she had chosen to build her life with. Lacey was, by every account from friends and family, a genuinely exceptional person. Someone who filled every room she entered with warmth and laughter, who was fiercely devoted to her loved ones, and who had spent years dreaming of starting a family of her own. She and Scott were married in 1997, and in the years that followed they settled in Modesto, California, to be closer to Lacey's family, where Scott found work as a fertilizer salesman and Lacey worked as a substitute teacher before turning her energies toward the home the couple was building together. In the early months of 2002, Lacey discovered she was pregnant with the couple's first child, a son they had decided to name Connor, and those who knew her described her joy at the news as pure and complete. She decorated a nursery, made plans for her son's arrival, and spoke openly about how deeply she was looking forward to motherhood. What Lacey did not know, and what the investigation that followed her disappearance would reveal in devastating detail, was that her husband had been living an entirely different emotional reality during those same months. In late November of 2002, Scott Peterson met a massage therapist from Fresno named Amber Fry at a social gathering, introduced to her by a mutual friend who described Scott as someone who was looking to meet the one. Scott told Amber Fry that he was unmarried and unattached. He told her he had never been married. He invited her into a relationship and spoke to her about a future together, all while his pregnant wife was at home in Modesto, preparing for the birth of their son and trusting completely in the man she had married. On December 9, 2002, just 15 days before Lacey's disappearance, Scott told Amber Fry something that would later become one of the most chilling details in the entire case. He told her that he had lost his wife, that she had died, and that the coming Christmas would be his first without her. Lacey Peterson was alive. She was 8 months pregnant, and her husband was telling another woman that she was already gone. On Christmas Eve of 2002, Scott told police he had last seen Lacey at approximately 9:30 in the morning, before he left the house to go on a solo fishing trip to Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay, a location he had only recently visited for the first time after purchasing a small fishing boat just weeks earlier. When Scott returned home that afternoon, he claimed to find the house empty except for their dog, Mackenzie, who was wandering in the backyard with his leash still attached. He reported Lacey missing to police that evening, and within hours the investigation was underway. From the very beginning, investigators noted details about Scott's behavior that struck them as deeply inconsistent with that of a genuinely distraught husband. He appeared composed in a way that seemed disconnected from the situation. He spoke about Lacey using language that felt distant, and most significantly, he declined to take a polygraph examination at a time when most innocent spouses in such situations eagerly volunteer to cooperate in any way possible. The discovery of his secret relationship with Amber Fry, which became public when she came forward to police on December 30th, shattered the image Scott had been trying to project and provided investigators with the first clear picture of a man who was not who he had claimed to be. As the search for Lacey continued through the winter months and into early spring of 2003, Scott gave a nationally televised interview in which he denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance while simultaneously making statements that investigators and the public found deeply troubling. Meanwhile, Amber Fry, working with law enforcement and recording her conversations with Scott, captured a remarkable series of phone calls in which Scott, still pretending to be a grieving widower unaware of his wife's fate, called Amber on New Year's Eve while standing at the candlelight vigil for his missing pregnant wife and told her he was watching fireworks near the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The recordings of those calls, in which his voice shifted between casualness and calculation while thousands of people searched for the mother of his unborn child, became some of the most significant evidence in the prosecution's case. On April 13, 2003, the body of a male fetus washed ashore at the Richmond Marina near San Francisco Bay, just 1 mile from where Scott had claimed to go fishing on Christmas Eve. The following day, April 14th, the badly decomposed remains of a young woman washed ashore nearby. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had feared. The woman was Lacey Peterson, and the infant was baby Connor. Scott was arrested on April 18, 2003, near San Diego while attempting to cross into Mexico. When officers pulled his vehicle over, they found inside it a significant amount of cash, multiple cell phones, a collection of identification documents belonging to other people, and bottles of hair dye. He had colored his dark hair blonde in the days since the bodies were discovered. The prosecution's case, presented by District Attorney Rick DeStaso, was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, a fact that the defense used aggressively throughout the trial but which the jury ultimately found sufficient to support a guilty verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution argued that Scott had decided to end his marriage and eliminate the responsibility of fatherhood so he could pursue the life he wanted with Amber Fry and potentially others, and that he had disposed of Lacey's body from his small boat at the Berkeley Marina, weighted her remains so they would sink, and then constructed an elaborate false narrative to conceal what he had done. On November 12, 2004, after a 5-month trial that had become one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history, a jury of 6 men and 6 women found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son Connor. The distinction between the two charges, premeditated murder for Lacey, second-degree for Connor, reflected the jury's finding that the taking of Lacey's life was planned and deliberate. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse erupted in cheers when the verdict was announced. Scott showed no emotion. On March 16, 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucci sentenced Scott Peterson to death, describing the murders as cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row. In August of 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death sentence on the grounds that jurors had not been properly questioned about their views on capital punishment during jury selection. Critically, however, the court upheld the guilty verdict entirely. In December of 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he was later transferred to Mule Creek State Prison in California, where he remains today. As of 2026, Scott Peterson continues to maintain his innocence and has attracted the attention of innocence advocacy organizations who argue that the circumstantial nature of the evidence and various procedural issues in his trial warrant further examination. Lacey's mother, Sharon Rocha, has spent the decades since her daughter's death advocating publicly for victims of domestic violence and speaking with extraordinary courage about the grief that has defined her life since that Christmas Eve when her daughter never came home. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old. Connor Peterson never drew a single breath outside his mother's body. And the man who was supposed to protect them both used his charm, his composure, and his capacity for deception to walk away from the greatest responsibility he had ever been given, and to answer for it only after the waters of San Francisco Bay gave up the truth he had tried to hide forever. Number 3. Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the legal dynasty that collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. For nearly a century, the name Murdaugh meant something specific and powerful in the Lowcountry region of South Carolina, a stretch of coastal communities and rural counties where the family's legal dominance was so complete and so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life that locals had long since taken to calling the area simply Murdaugh Country. From 1920 through 2006, a member of the Murdaugh family served continuously as the elected solicitor, the chief local prosecutor, for South Carolina's 14th Judicial Circuit, a 5-county region covering Hampton, Colleton, Allendale, Beaufort, and Jasper counties, and that unbroken 86-year hold on prosecutorial power gave the family an influence over law enforcement, the judiciary, and the legal community that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The family had also founded a prominent personal injury law firm, Peters Murdaugh Parker Eltsroth and Dietrich, known locally as PMPED, which had grown over generations into one of the most successful such practices in the region and which would later be known simply as the Parker Law Group after the family's disgrace. Richard Alexander Murdaugh, known to everyone as Alex, was born into this dynasty and raised entirely within its structures of privilege and expectation. He attended the University of South Carolina for his undergraduate degree and then for law school, and upon passing the bar he joined PMPED, where he built a reputation as an aggressive and successful personal injury attorney who was deeply connected to the legal and law enforcement communities across the Lowcountry. He married Margaret Maggie Murdaugh, and together they raised 2 sons, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., known as Buster, and Paul Terry Murdaugh. The family lived in a manner entirely consistent with their generational wealth and local prominence, maintaining a sprawling 1,700-acre hunting estate called Moselle in Islandton, South Carolina, as well as a beach house on Edisto Island. To those who encountered the family socially, they appeared to represent the best of what their community offered. Well-connected, generous, and rooted in a tradition of legal service that spanned generations. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, a very different reality had been taking shape for years, one defined by financial crimes of staggering scope and audacity that Alex Murdaugh had been committing against the very clients and colleagues who trusted him most. According to the evidence that would eventually emerge in the legal proceedings against him, Alex Murdaugh had been stealing money through a web of fraudulent schemes for more than a decade, diverting client settlement funds into accounts he controlled, fabricating legal fees, and exploiting the trust of some of the most vulnerable people who came to him seeking help, the injured, the grieving, the families of those who had died, to enrich himself while passing himself off as their advocate. Investigators would ultimately determine that he had stolen more than $12 million through these schemes, money that flowed not into the legitimate operations of his law firm, but into personal accounts that funded a lifestyle increasingly difficult to sustain through legitimate means, and which also, investigators believed, funded a serious opioid addiction that Alex Murdaugh had been concealing from his family, his colleagues, and the public for many years. The first crack in the Murdaugh family's public image appeared in the early hours of February 24, 2019, when a boat owned by Alex Murdaugh and operated that night by his younger son Paul, then 19 years old, crashed into the pilings of Archer's Creek Bridge near Parris Island in Beaufort County, South Carolina. 6 young people had been on the boat, and when the crash occurred, one of them, 19-year-old Mallory Beach, was ejected into the water and disappeared. Paul Murdaugh's blood alcohol level was found to be 3 times the legal limit. Mallory Beach's body was recovered 8 days later, approximately 5 miles from the crash site. Paul was eventually indicted on 3 felony counts of boating under the influence causing death and serious bodily injury, and Mallory's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Murdaugh family that would ultimately trigger a financial reckoning Alex Murdaugh was entirely unprepared to face. The Beach family's attorneys, in pursuing the civil case, began seeking financial records and depositions that threatened to expose the fraudulent schemes Alex had spent years carefully concealing. In February of 2018, even before the boat crash, the Murdaugh family had experienced another death on their property when their longtime housekeeper of more than 20 years, Gloria Satterfield, aged 57, died following what was described as a trip and fall accident on the front steps of the family estate. No coroner was called to the scene. No autopsy was performed. The death was accepted without formal investigation, a reflection of the deference that law enforcement and official institutions had long extended to the Murdaugh family. Alex subsequently filed a wrongful death claim through Satterfield's sons, and the family's insurance company paid out $4.3 million, none of which ever reached the Satterfield family. It went, investigators would later determine, directly into accounts controlled by Alex Murdaugh. By the spring of 2021, as the civil litigation stemming from the boat crash continued to expand and deepen, and as the financial accounting it required grew ever more threatening, Alex Murdaugh's position had become increasingly precarious. The law firm that bore his family's name was growing suspicious about missing fees and unaccounted for funds, and multiple threads of a financial investigation that could expose everything he had spent years concealing were beginning to pull at once. On the evening of June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh placed a call to 911 and reported that he had arrived at the kennel area of the Moselle estate to find the bodies of his wife Maggie and his son Paul. Both had been fatally shot. Paul was 22 years old, just weeks away from what would have been a significant hearing in his boating under the influence case. Maggie was 52. In the immediate aftermath, Alex was publicly positioned as a grieving husband and father, a victim of a terrible and as yet unsolved act, and the community that had deferred to the Murdaugh name for generations extended him the same benefit of the doubt it always had. But investigators were not satisfied. The evidence they gathered in the days and weeks that followed began to tell a very different story. Most significantly, a cell phone video recovered from Paul Murdaugh's phone, discovered in 2022 by investigators reviewing electronic evidence, placed Alex Murdaugh at the dog kennels, the scene of the shootings, just 4 minutes before the time of death was established at approximately 8:50 in the evening of June 7. Alex had told investigators repeatedly and consistently that he had never been at the kennels that evening, that he had been napping at the main house and had then gone to visit his elderly mother. The video, in which Alex's voice was clearly captured during a conversation with Paul and Maggie in the kennel area, directly contradicted every version of events he had offered. On July 14, 2022, a grand jury indicted Alex Murdaugh on 2 counts of murder. The trial, which began on January 25, 2023, in Walterboro, South Carolina, was one of the most widely followed legal proceedings in the country that year, a 6-week examination of a family whose fall from grace had revealed how completely the structures of power and privilege could protect wrongdoing for decades before finally giving way. 76 witnesses testified. Prosecutors argued that Alex had taken the lives of his wife and son to create a distraction from the financial scandal that was about to consume him, to generate sympathy that might delay the inevitable exposure of his crimes, and to potentially eliminate witnesses who might have known more than he was comfortable with. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters described the motive in his closing argument as rooted in greed, power, and facade. A man so committed to the image he had constructed that he was willing to sacrifice the people he claimed to love most rather than allow that image to collapse. On March 2, 2023, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. Alex Murdaugh stood expressionless as the verdict was read. His surviving son Buster, who had stood by his father throughout the proceedings, shook his head. The following day, Judge Clifton Newman sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, describing the case as particularly troubling given that Murdaugh had appeared before him in court throughout his legal career and had now been convicted of taking the lives of the very family members he had publicly mourned. In the aftermath of the murder conviction, Alex entered guilty pleas to 22 state charges and 22 federal charges related to his financial crimes and was ordered to pay more than $8.7 million in restitution. In a significant legal development that emerged in May of 2026, the South Carolina Supreme Court overturned Alex Murdaugh's murder conviction and ordered a new trial, finding that the trial had been compromised by the improper conduct of the county court clerk, who had communicated with jurors in a manner that violated the integrity of the proceedings. That ruling does not change the guilty pleas Alex entered on the financial crimes, and he remains incarcerated pending the retrial on the murder charges. Maggie Murdaugh was 52 years old. Paul Murdaugh was 22. And the family dynasty that 3 generations of Murdaughs had built across nearly a century of service to their community was dismantled, in the end, not by an outside force but by the man who had inherited it. Number 4, Timothy Ray Jones Jr., the father who chose the unthinkable. There are acts of betrayal so complete, so total in their disregard for the most fundamental of human bonds, that the mind struggles to process them in any framework of normal human experience, and the case of Timothy Ray Jones Jr., whose 5 young children were found deceased in garbage bags on a rural Alabama hillside in September of 2014, represents one of the most disturbing examples of paternal failure in the recorded history of American criminal justice. Timothy Jones Jr. was a 32-year-old software engineer living with his 5 children in a house on South Lake Drive in the Red Bank area of Lexington County, South Carolina, at the time the events in question unfolded. He and his former wife, Amber Jones, had separated and custody of their 5 children. 8-year-old Mara Gracie, 7-year-old Elias, 6-year-old Naughton, 2-year-old Gabriel, and 1-year-old Abigail Elaine, had been awarded to Timothy. The children ranged from an infant to a 2nd grader, 5 human beings at the most vulnerable stages of their existence, entirely dependent on the protection and care of the father the court had entrusted with their well-being. Timothy Jones Jr. worked in the technology sector and, from a professional standpoint, had achieved a level of stability and responsibility that spoke to his capabilities as an adult member of society. But behind that professional exterior, a very different picture was forming in the weeks and days leading up to the night of August 28, 2014, a picture defined by escalating instability, questionable decisions, and a pattern of behavior toward his children that child welfare investigators would later examine with profound regret. According to the full account that Timothy Jones provided in a recorded confession to investigators at a checkpoint in Smith County, Mississippi, where he was ultimately apprehended, the events of August 28 began with a confrontation between himself and his 6-year-old son Naughton over a broken electrical outlet in the family home. In his confession, Jones described becoming enraged at Naughton's denial that he had damaged the outlet, and he described subjecting the child to a prolonged and punishing physical ordeal as a form of discipline that escalated to the point where Naughton lost consciousness and did not recover. When Timothy Jones realized that Naughton had died, he did not call emergency services. He did not seek help. According to his own account and the evidence recovered from his cell phone, he spent time watching a video on his phone before arriving at the decision that no witnesses could remain. He then took the lives of his other 4 children, Mara, Elias, Gabriel, and Abigail, one by one. Mara, aged 8, and Elias, aged 7, were strangled by hand. Gabriel, aged 2, and Abigail, aged 1, were strangled using a belt. The cause of Naughton's death was officially listed as undetermined due to the condition of the remains. After taking the lives of all 5 of his children, Timothy Jones loaded their bodies into his sport utility vehicle and drove across 3 states over the course of 9 days, traveling from South Carolina through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, with the remains of his children in his vehicle, before stopping at a hillside near Camden, Alabama, where he placed the bodies of all 5 children into individual garbage bags and disposed of them on the slope. He then continued driving until he was stopped at a routine safety checkpoint in Smith County, Mississippi, on September 6, 2014, when a law enforcement officer noticed the smell of decomposition coming from his vehicle. Officers subsequently discovered the truth of what had been in Timothy Jones's SUV and obtained from him a full confession detailing what he had done. The investigation that followed reached back into the weeks before August 28 and painted a disturbing portrait of a household in increasing difficulty, a father struggling with the demands of sole custody of 5 very young children, and a pattern of concerning behavior that child welfare workers had been in the process of evaluating. The disappearance of the children had itself triggered a missing persons investigation in Lexington County, and the discovery of the confession and the subsequent recovery of the children's remains, found by investigators following the directions Jones provided, transformed what had been a missing persons case into one of the most heartbreaking criminal proceedings in South Carolina history. Timothy Jones Jr. was indicted on 5 counts of murder and was returned to South Carolina to stand trial in Lexington County. His defense team argued in the guilt phase of the trial that he suffered from significant mental illness and should be found not guilty by reason of insanity, contending that his mental state at the time of the events meant he had been unable to distinguish right from wrong. In the penalty phase, they urged the jury to consider his mental health history as a reason to spare his life and impose a sentence of life in prison rather than death. The jury rejected both arguments. On June 4, 2019, after more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Timothy Ray Jones Jr. guilty on all 5 counts of murder. 9 days later, on June 13, 2019, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the same jury sentenced him to death. Lead prosecutor Rick Hubbard, in his closing argument during the penalty phase, described Jones as the worst of the worst and told the jury that the man before them had sentenced those kids to death. Words that found their mark with jurors who had spent weeks hearing evidence about the 5 children whose lives had been taken before any of them had truly had the chance to live. Jones showed no emotion as the death sentence was delivered. An appeal to the South Carolina Supreme Court was subsequently rejected in 2023, with the court affirming both the conviction and the sentence after reviewing all 8 issues raised by the defense. Timothy Ray Jones Jr. currently sits on death row in South Carolina, awaiting the execution of a sentence that was rendered by a jury in full consideration of everything he had done. Mara Gracie Jones was 8 years old. Elias Jones was 7. Naughton Jones was 6. Gabriel Jones was 2. Abigail Elaine Jones was 1 year old. 5 children. 5 lives. 5 separate human beings who needed nothing more from their father than his protection, and who received instead the most complete and devastating betrayal imaginable. Number 5, Ronald Gene Simmons, the man who turned Christmas into a week of grief. There are events so extreme in their scope and so total in their destruction of human life that they occupy a category entirely their own in the history of criminal violence. And the killing spree carried out by Ronald Gene Simmons Sr. across the final week of December 1987 in rural Arkansas stands as the worst single perpetrator family massacre in the recorded history of the United States, a crime that claimed 16 lives over the course of 6 days, and that left an entire region permanently scarred by what one man had been capable of doing to the people who depended on him most. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois, and spent much of his early life moving between states as his family relocated for various reasons. He dropped out of school at 17 and joined the United States Navy in 1957, eventually transitioning to service in the United States Air Force, where he would serve until 1979, rising to the rank of Master Sergeant over a career that spanned more than 2 decades. During his military service, Simmons married a woman named Bersabe Rebecca Ulibarri, and together they had 7 children. But the military career and the family life it sustained concealed a pattern of behavior that those close to the family found deeply troubling. Simmons was described by those who encountered him as intensely authoritarian, controlling, and isolated in his worldview. Someone who ran his household with a rigidity that left no room for individual expression or independence, and who had throughout his life demonstrated a possessive relationship with his family that went far beyond the bounds of normal parental authority. Following his military retirement in 1979, the family settled eventually in a remote and isolated property in the foothills of the Ozarks near Dover in Pope County, Arkansas, a location that Simmons had seemingly chosen specifically for its isolation. A tract of land known as Mockingbird Hill that had no telephone, no indoor plumbing, and was surrounded by a tall makeshift fence that kept the family cut off from the outside world in a way that had struck at least some people who knew them as deeply abnormal. Simmons worked a series of unremarkable jobs in the nearby town of Russellville over the following years, and by December of 1987 he had most recently been employed at a small convenience store, a position from which he resigned on December 18th, just 4 days before the events that would claim the lives of 14 members of his immediate family began. What motivated Ronald Gene Simmons to do what he did on December 22, 1987, has never been fully or satisfactorily explained. The killing of his family began on December 22, when Simmons took the lives of his wife Becky, their adult son Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., who was visiting for the Christmas holiday, and a 3-year-old grandchild. He had instructed his children in the days prior to dig a large hole on the property, telling them it was for an outhouse. That hole would serve as a burial site for some of the family members he took from the world that week. As the younger Simmons children arrived home from school for their Christmas break in the days that followed, Simmons greeted each one individually, telling them he had a present to give them one at a time. What followed was a systematic taking of each child's life in turn. By the time he was finished with the property at Mockingbird Hill, Simmons had taken the lives of 14 members of his own family, including his wife, children, and grandchildren. He placed some of the victims in the deep hole that had been dug on the property. Others were concealed in abandoned vehicles around the acreage. In one of the most chilling details of the case, investigators later reported that Simmons had arranged several of the deceased family members around a dinner table in a macabre recreation of the Christmas gathering he had chosen to destroy. On December 28, 1987, 6 days after the events at Mockingbird Hill had begun, Ronald Gene Simmons drove into the town of Russellville and entered several locations: a law firm, an oil company, a convenience store, and his former workplace at Woodline Motor Freight, where he shot multiple individuals. 2 people were killed in this portion of the rampage: Joyce Butts, a secretary at the oil company, and Kathy Kendrick, a receptionist at a law firm. 4 others were seriously wounded. The entire rampage through Russellville took approximately 45 minutes. When Simmons had finished at Woodline Motor Freight, he surrendered to a secretary there and waited calmly for police to arrive, handing over his weapon without resistance when officers appeared. His words as he waited were recorded and later reported widely: "I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." When officers were unable to reach any member of the Simmons family by phone, 2 deputies drove to the isolated Mockingbird Hill property and discovered what Simmons had left behind. The full accounting of the family members he had taken from the world during that Christmas week included his wife Becky, his son Ronald Jr., his daughters Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky Jr., and several grandchildren, 16 members of his family and community in total. Ronald Gene Simmons was tried in 2 separate proceedings. In the first trial, held in Franklin County in May of 1988, he was convicted of the capital murder of the 2 people taken from the world during the Russellville portion of the rampage and was sentenced to death plus 147 years. He declined to appeal. In a second trial in February of 1989, held in Pope County for the murders of his family members at Mockingbird Hill, he was again convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death on an additional 8 counts. He again declined to appeal, stating that any sentence less than death would, in his view, constitute cruel and unusual punishment for what he had done. On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Arkansas, becoming the first person executed in the state since 1964. He offered no final statement. The 14 members of the Simmons family who were taken from the world at Mockingbird Hill in December 1987 had names, had futures, had the reasonable expectation that the man who was supposed to be their protector was on their side. They deserved infinitely more than they received from the man who claimed authority over their lives. Number 6. Josh Powell, the husband who made his sons disappear twice. There are cases in the long and deeply troubling catalog of true crime that are not defined by a single event but by an accumulation of choices, each one worse than the last, each one representing another step away from everything a parent is supposed to be, and the case of Joshua Powell, which began with the disappearance of his wife Susan Cox Powell from their home in West Valley City, Utah on December 6, 2009, and ended with an act of devastating finality in a suburb of Tacoma, Washington on February 5, 2012, is precisely that kind of case. A story that unfolded over more than 2 years in full view of investigators, social workers, family court judges, and a national audience that had been following every development, and that still ended in the worst possible way because every safeguard that should have protected 2 small boys ultimately proved insufficient. Susan Marie Cox was born on October 16, 1981, and was by all accounts a devoted mother and a warm, genuine young woman who had married Joshua Powell in 2001 and had built a life with him in the Salt Lake City area of Utah, where they raised their 2 sons, Charlie and Braden. Joshua Powell was, from early in his adult life, described by those who knew him as deeply unusual in his social behavior. Isolated, controlling, financially erratic, and possessed of a worldview that revolved almost entirely around his own needs and perspective. The marriage was described by friends of Susan's as difficult, and Susan had confided to people close to her that life with Josh was not what she had hoped it would be, that he was demanding and controlling, and that she felt constrained in ways she struggled to articulate fully. On the morning of December 6, 2009, Susan attended church with her sons and visited with a friend that afternoon before returning home, where she mentioned feeling unwell and said she wanted to rest. Josh, who rarely cooked for the family, had prepared pancakes for Susan before she began to feel ill. The following morning, when Charlie and Braden were not dropped off at daycare and both Josh and Susan failed to appear for work, Susan's sister reported the family missing. When officers arrived at the family home, they found a scene that immediately raised serious concerns. Fans had been set up and were running, pointed at wet spots on the carpet that appeared to have been recently cleaned, and Susan's cell phone was found in Josh's car rather than with her. Josh Powell eventually returned home late on December 7th with the 2 boys, claiming that he had taken them on a spontaneous camping trip to a desert area in Tooele County in the middle of the night, despite the fact that the area in question was experiencing near freezing temperatures and blizzard conditions. Susan, he claimed, had stayed home because she was tired. One of the boys, young Charlie, told a police investigator at the time that Mommy went camping with them, though he added that she did not come back with them and he did not know why. Susan Cox Powell was never found. Her body has never been recovered. Investigators identified Joshua Powell as the primary person of interest from the very beginning of the inquiry, and a review of the evidence that was later made public confirmed the extraordinary depth of their suspicions. Blood evidence consistent with Susan's had been discovered in the family home, life insurance policies had been taken out on Susan, and Josh had filed paperwork to access her retirement accounts in the days immediately following her disappearance. But without a body and without a crime scene that could definitively establish what had happened, investigators were unable to bring charges, and Josh Powell used that gap in the evidence to resist cooperation with the investigation while simultaneously seeking to control the public narrative around his missing wife. Following Susan's disappearance, Josh relocated with his sons to Puyallup, Washington, moving in with his father Steve Powell, whose own deeply troubling behavior around children would later result in his arrest and conviction on charges of voyeurism and child pornography. The presence of his sons in that household became a serious concern for Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, who began a determined legal fight for custody of Charlie and Braden. In February of 2012, as investigators in Washington state had signaled that an arrest of Josh Powell in connection with Susan's disappearance was increasingly imminent, a family court in Washington made the determination that the boys' custody would be moved to their maternal grandparents. A supervised visitation with Josh was scheduled for the afternoon of February 5, 2012, at his rental home in Graham, a community in Pierce County south of Tacoma. A contracted social worker, Casey Cox, drove Charlie and Braden to the appointment, arriving at the house with the 2 boys. When the children ran to the door and Josh opened it, He immediately pushed Charlie and Braden inside and locked the door in the social worker's face. She called 911. Within minutes, the house was engulfed in fire from an explosion that could be heard by neighbors across the surrounding streets. When first responders arrived and extinguished the fire, they found the remains of Joshua Powell and his 2 sons inside. Josh had taken his sons' lives and then ended his own, choosing an act of total destruction over the prospect of facing accountability for what he had done. Charlie Powell was 7 years old. Braden Powell was 5. In the years that followed, Susan's parents pursued a wrongful death lawsuit against the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, arguing that state negligence in the supervision of the custody arrangements had contributed to the deaths of their grandsons. In July of 2020, a jury awarded the Cox family $98.5 million, a verdict that was subsequently reduced by a lower court judge and then reinstated in full by the Washington Court of Appeals in April of 2023. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared. She has never been found. The case remains officially open, classified as a missing persons investigation, though law enforcement has consistently stated its belief that she was taken from the world by her husband on the night of December 6, 2009. 3 members of one family, a young mother and her 2 small sons, were lost because one man chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to protect himself rather than the people who needed him most. Number 7. John Emil List, the man who disappeared for 18 years. There is a particular quality to the crimes of John Emil List that distinguishes them even within the deeply disturbing category of familicide. Not just the acts themselves, which were calculated and deliberate and devastating in their finality, but the extraordinary aftermath, a disappearance so complete and so carefully engineered that it took 18 years, a nationally televised program, a forensic sculptor, and the sharp eyes of a neighbor in a Virginia suburb before justice was finally delivered. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, and from the earliest years of his adult life he presented himself to the world as a model of conventional American virtue. A devout Lutheran who attended church faithfully every Sunday, a Boy Scout troop leader, a strict and disciplined father, and a hard-working accountant who measured his worth almost entirely through his professional success and his adherence to the moral and religious frameworks he had inherited from his upbringing. He served in the United States Army during the Second World War and afterward completed his education at the University of Michigan, where he studied business and accounting, and it was during this period that he met and married Helen Morris Taylor, a widow several years his senior who had a daughter from her previous marriage. John and Helen went on to have 3 children of their own, a daughter named Patricia and 2 sons, John Jr. and Frederick. By the mid-1960s, the family had settled into a 19-room Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, a property of considerable grandeur that included a ballroom, marble fireplaces, and a Tiffany glass skylight, and that John List had purchased in a moment of professional optimism that his financial situation would very shortly begin to undermine in ways that he was constitutionally incapable of confronting openly. The gap between the life John List was presenting to the outside world and the life he was actually living had been widening steadily for several years before November of 1971. He had lost his position as a vice president at a New Jersey bank in 1970, a significant professional setback that he concealed from his family and neighbors by continuing to leave home in the morning dressed for work, driving to New York City, and spending his days in the public library rather than admitting what had happened. The family's mortgage was in arrears. Creditors were pursuing the household. The mansion that John List had presented as the symbol of his family's success was on the verge of being foreclosed upon. He had borrowed money from his elderly mother Alma, who lived with the family in the mansion's 3rd-floor apartment and who was by this point legally blind. His wife Helen was in poor health and had developed what he viewed as an inappropriate interest in the social freedoms of the 1960s, which conflicted with his deeply conservative religious worldview. And his 16-year-old daughter Patricia was involved in her high school's theater program, an involvement that John List found morally threatening in ways that said far more about his own psychology than about any failing on Patricia's part. In the weeks and months leading up to November 9, 1971, John List engaged in a meticulous and deliberate process of planning. He canceled the family's mail delivery, newspaper subscription, and milk service, eliminating the external observers who might otherwise notice too quickly that something was wrong. He arranged for the house's lights to remain on through timers, creating the impression from outside that the family was going about its normal routine. He set the intercom system to play organ music through the house. He wrote a 5-page letter addressed to his Lutheran pastor, explaining in formal and almost clinical terms what he was about to do and the reasons he believed justified it. Chief among them his fear that his family's financial ruin and what he characterized as the corrupting moral influences of the world around them would lead his wife and children away from the Lutheran faith and therefore away from the salvation he believed would await them in heaven if he acted to preserve their souls. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List moved through the mansion and took the lives of his wife Helen, his mother Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, 16, John Jr., 15, and Frederick, 13, one by one. He then arranged their bodies in sleeping bags on the ballroom floor with a care that he apparently understood as an expression of love. He left the letter for his pastor in the kitchen, collected what money remained in various accounts, drove his car to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, abandoned the vehicle there, and walked away into a life that no one who knew him would encounter again for nearly 2 decades. It was not until December 7, 1971, nearly a month after the murders, that neighbors, concerned about the constantly burning lights and the absence of any sign of normal family activity, finally contacted police. Officers who entered the mansion found the 5 bodies in the ballroom, still in the sleeping bags where John List had placed them, alongside the letter explaining everything he had done and why he believed he had been right to do it. The investigation that followed quickly identified John List as the only possible suspect, but he had vanished so completely that every attempt to locate him came to nothing. For 18 years, John List lived under the assumed name of Robert Peter Clark, moving first to the western United States before eventually settling in Richmond, Virginia, where he found work as an accountant, the same profession he had practiced under his real name. Remarried a woman named Dolores Miller who had no knowledge of his true identity, and attended church regularly, continuing the outward observance of a faith that had formed the stated justification for the worst thing he had ever done. The break in the case came on May 21, 1989, when the nationally broadcast television program America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the List family murders, accompanied by a remarkably accurate forensic sculpture created by forensic artist Frank Bender, who had been commissioned to create an age-progressed bust of what John List might look like nearly 2 decades after the crimes. The bust was extraordinarily precise. Within days of the broadcast, a woman who had been watching the program recognized the sculpture as bearing a striking resemblance to her neighbor in the Richmond suburb where she lived, a quiet, church-going accountant named Bob Clark. She called the program's tip line. Officers followed up, spoke to Dolores Clark, and arrested John Emil List at his accounting office on June 1, 1989. He was 63 years old. When asked at the time of his arrest to confirm his identity, he denied being John List. DNA evidence confirmed the truth. John List was extradited to New Jersey, tried for 5 counts of first-degree murder, and convicted on April 11, 1990, after 9 hours of jury deliberation. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, the maximum allowed under New Jersey law at the time. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentence was announced. John Emil List died in a New Jersey prison on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, having spent the final 18 years of his life incarcerated for the 5 murders he had committed 18 years before that. He never expressed genuine remorse. In a prison interview with journalist Connie Chung years after his conviction, he stated his belief that his family had forgiven him and that when he reached heaven they would be reunited and the events of November 9, 1971, would no longer matter. Helen List, Alma List, Patricia List, John List Jr., and Frederick List mattered. Their lives mattered, and the rationalizations of the man who ended those lives do nothing to change that truth. Number 8. Christian Michael Longo, the fugitive who became someone else. There is something particularly disturbing about the case of Christian Michael Longo, not only in the nature of what he did to the 4 members of his immediate family in December of 2001 along the Oregon coast, but in the manner in which he responded to having done it, the swiftness with which he shed his identity and constructed a new one, the ease with which he inserted himself into a completely different life in a different country, and the extraordinary detail with which he later admitted, years after his conviction, to having felt almost nothing in the immediate aftermath of taking the lives of his wife and 3 small children. Christian Michael Longo was born in 1974 and raised in a religious household affiliated with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and those who knew him in his early adult years described him as personable, ambitious in his self-presentation, and possessed of a talent for making a strong first impression that frequently disguised a pattern of behavior built on financial dishonesty and a chronic inability to sustain any version of the life he was trying to project to the world. He married a woman named Mary Jane Clark, and together they had 3 children: Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. The family relocated multiple times over the years as Longo's financial difficulties mounted, and by the late 1990s and early 2000s a pattern had emerged of check fraud, stolen goods, and debts left unpaid as the family moved from place to place one step ahead of the consequences of decisions Christian Longo had made and never disclosed fully to his wife. By late 2001, the family was living in a 1-bedroom condominium in Newport, Oregon, on the Yaquina Bay coast, a residence that, by any reasonable assessment of their financial situation, was far beyond what they could afford. Christian was working part-time at a Starbucks for approximately $7.40 per hour, and the accumulated weight of years of financial mismanagement had left the family in a position from which there appeared to be no straightforward exit. Mary Jane had reportedly threatened to leave Christian and take the children, a development that investigators later cited as a possible catalyst for what happened in the final days of December 2001. On December 19, 2001, the body of 4-year-old Zachary Longo was discovered floating in a marina in Waldport, Oregon. The body of 3-year-old Sadie Longo was recovered nearby shortly afterward. 8 days later, investigators found 2 suitcases floating in Yaquina Bay, close to the apartment the family had shared. Inside those suitcases were the remains of Mary Jane Longo, 34 years old, and her 2-year-old daughter Madison. All 4 members of the Longo family had lost their lives, and the only person missing from the picture was Christian Michael Longo. Within days of the bodies being discovered, investigators had compiled sufficient evidence to connect Christian to the deaths of his family, and he was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, a designation that reflected both the severity of what the evidence suggested and the urgency of finding him before he could disappear further. What investigators discovered was that Christian had purchased a plane ticket to Mexico using a stolen credit card number and had been living at a beachside campground in Tulum, in the Quintana Roo region of Mexico, near Cancun, where he had given himself the identity of Michael Finkel, a real journalist who wrote for the New York Times Magazine and whose identity Christian had appropriated without his knowledge. He made little effort to conceal himself at the campsite, using a variation of his real surname and presenting himself openly and sociably to those around him. He was arrested by Mexican law enforcement and FBI agents on January 13, 2002, and voluntarily agreed to return to the United States, waiving extradition in a brief appearance before a Texas court before being transported to the Lincoln County Jail in Newport, Oregon. At his trial in 2003, Christian Longo offered an account that the court found wholly unpersuasive. He claimed that Mary Jane had taken the lives of 2 of the children in a fit of desperation, and that he had then taken Mary Jane's life and that of the remaining child in a reaction to what he had witnessed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. Christian Longo's case was given an additional dimension by the relationship he developed during the period between his arrest and his trial with Michael Finkel, the journalist whose identity he had stolen in Mexico. Finkel, whose career had been significantly damaged by an unrelated professional incident around the same period, became fascinated by Longo and began corresponding with and visiting him during his pre-trial incarceration. That relationship, in which Longo charmed and misled Finkel in much the same way he had apparently misled everyone throughout his adult life, became the subject of Finkel's 2005 memoir titled True Story, Murder Memoir Mea Culpa, which was adapted into a film in 2015. In 2011, Longo admitted for the first time to investigators and publicly that he had in fact taken the lives of all 4 members of his family, abandoning the version of events he had offered at trial. In December of 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted the death sentences of all 17 inmates on Oregon's death row to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a decision that affected Longo's sentence as well. He remains incarcerated at Oregon State Penitentiary. Penny Baker Dupuy, the sister of Mary Jane Longo, has spoken publicly about the impact of the governor's commutation decision. expressing devastation at the news and describing the sentence as an inadequate accounting for what was done to her sister and 3 nieces and nephew. Mary Jane Longo was 34. Zachary was 4. Sadie was 3. Madison was 2 years old. And Christian Longo, who had stolen the identity of a journalist to enjoy weeks of beach life while his family lay in the waters off the Oregon coast, has spent the subsequent decades in a cell, which is precisely where the evidence of his choices determined he should remain. Number 9. Faleh Hassan al-Maliki, the father who called it honor. The case of Faleh Hassan al-Maliki represents one of the most disturbing examples of what happens when a father decides that his own sense of cultural authority matters more than the life of the daughter he was supposed to protect. A case in which a 20-year-old young woman's desire for an ordinary American life, to choose her own relationships, to attend college, to live on her own terms, was treated by her father as an offense so serious that it justified taking her life in a parking lot in suburban Arizona in the middle of the afternoon in full view of witnesses, and which ultimately forced American law enforcement and the broader public to reckon seriously with the reality that so-called honor-based violence was not a phenomenon confined to distant countries but something that could and did occur on American soil with American victims. Faleh Hassan al-Maliki was an Iraqi immigrant who had moved his family from Iraq to the Phoenix suburb of Glendale, Arizona, in the mid-1990s, settling in a community where other members of the Iraqi Kurdish diaspora had established themselves, and where the family maintained a cultural and social framework consistent with the traditions they had brought with them from their homeland. His daughter Noor Faleh al-Maliki was born in Iraq and came to the United States as a child, growing up in the Phoenix area in an environment that was, by her own account and the accounts of those who knew her, deeply conflicted between the expectations of her father and the life she saw available to her in the American world around her. Noor was, by every description from friends and contemporaries, a warm, thoughtful, and determined young woman who wanted the things that most young American women want. A chance to build her own life, to pursue her own interests, to choose her own relationships, and to live according to her own values rather than those imposed upon her. The conflict between what Noor wanted and what her father demanded became acute when, at 17, she refused to comply with arrangements for a marriage to a relative in Iraq, a refusal that enraged Faleh al-Maliki and created a fracture in their relationship that never fully closed. Over the following years, Noor made repeated attempts to establish independence from her family, moving into her own apartment, working at a fast food restaurant, and eventually, in 2009, moving into the home of her boyfriend and his family, Raykan and Amal Khalaf, after she told the Khalaf family that her parents had been physically abusive. Faleh al-Maliki's response to his daughter's growing independence was characterized by a persistent and documented pattern of harassment. Appearing at her workplace, confronting her in person, warning Raykan Khalaf that something bad was going to happen if Noor was not returned to the family home, and making clear through his words and actions that he did not accept the legitimacy of the choices his daughter was making about her own life. On October 20, 2009, Noor al-Maliki and Amal Khalaf drove together to a Department of Economic Security office in the Phoenix suburb of Peoria in connection with a welfare-related appointment. While they were inside the building, Noor spotted her father in the waiting area and immediately became frightened, texting a friend in rapid succession, "Dude, my dad is here at the welfare office. I'm so shaky. I knew I shouldn't have woke up." And then, in what would prove to be a heartbreaking moment of clarity, "I've honestly never met anyone with so much evil." When Noor and Amal Khalaf left the office to walk to a nearby restaurant, Faleh al-Maliki was waiting. He drove his Jeep Cherokee directly at the two women in the parking lot, striking both of them. The vehicle rolled over Noor, causing severe head injuries and multiple facial fractures. Amal Khalaf was also seriously injured. Faleh al-Maliki then fled the scene, driving to Mexico before eventually being located and detained by authorities in London, England, from where he was returned to the United States to face justice. Noor al-Maliki was placed in intensive care and never regained consciousness. She died on November 2, 2009, nearly 2 weeks after being struck by her father's vehicle. She was 20 years old. During his interrogation by Peoria Police Detective Christopher Bowie, Faleh al-Maliki admitted that he had deliberately driven at his daughter, though at other points he characterized the incident as accidental. At trial, his defense attorneys argued that he had intended only to spit at Amal Khalaf and had lost control of the vehicle, calling no witnesses in support of this account. Prosecutors presented the recorded interrogation and played prison phone calls in which al-Maliki and his wife were heard discussing how an Iraqi without honor is nothing, and lamenting that while Faileh suffered in jail, Noor was comfortable now in her grave. The jury did not accept the defense's characterization. On February 22, 2011, Faileh Hassan al-Maliki was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of his daughter, aggravated assault for the serious injuries caused to Amal Khalaf, and 2 counts of leaving the scene of an accident, the jury having rejected the first-degree murder charge that would have required proof of premeditation. On April 15, 2011, Judge Roland Steinley sentenced him to a total of 34.5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. 16 years for the murder conviction, served concurrently with a 15-year aggravated assault sentence, plus consecutive additional terms for leaving the scene of the accident. Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery stated at the time of sentencing that dishonor, disrespect, and other cultural mores can never serve as a justification for the taking of an innocent life. Words that captured the legal and moral position of the American system in a case that had brought the concept of honor-based violence into a national conversation it could no longer avoid. Noor al-Maliki was 20 years old. She had wanted to go to college. She had wanted to choose her own life. She had texted a friend about the evil she saw in her father's eyes in the moments before he drove into her. She deserved the future she was reaching for, and the man who took it from her is serving his sentence in an Arizona prison, where that truth will remain unchanged regardless of what name he gave to his act. Number 10. Michael Haight, the man who chose control over everything. There are moments in the life of a community when everything that made ordinary life feel safe and predictable is suddenly and irrevocably altered. And for the residents of Enoch City in Iron County, Utah, the afternoon of January 4, 2023, was precisely that kind of moment. The day that 8 people were found deceased inside a family home on a quiet residential street in a community where violent crime was exceedingly rare and where the bonds of faith and shared experience had created a social fabric that most residents had never had any reason to question. Enoch City is a small, close-knit community in southwestern Utah, home to a population that is predominantly affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and in this setting the Haight family, Michael Haight, aged 42, his wife Tasha Haight, aged 40, their 5 children Macy, 17, Briley, 12, twins Ammon and Sienna, both 7, and Gavin, 4, along with Tasha's mother Gail Earl, aged 78, had been, by all outward appearances, a fixture of exactly the kind of family life the community valued most deeply. Michael and Tasha had been married for approximately 20 years. Michael worked at Allstate Insurance in the nearby city of Cedar City. The family was known in church and school circles, described by community members as a household that was well established and actively engaged in the life of the community around them. On January 4, 2023, a family friend grew concerned after Tasha Haight missed a scheduled appointment and was unreachable by phone, a departure from her normal patterns significant enough to prompt a welfare check request to local police. Officers arrived at the Haight residence that afternoon and, upon entering the home, made the discovery that would shatter the community's sense of safety and prompt a national conversation about domestic abuse, controlling relationships, and the devastating consequences that can unfold when warning signs are not adequately heeded. All 8 members of the household, including Michael Haight himself, were found deceased from apparent gunshot wounds. The Enoch Police Department subsequently released a statement identifying Michael Haight as the suspect and noting that evidence suggested he had taken his own life after taking the lives of his wife, 5 children, and mother-in-law. A 57-page investigative report released by Enoch City in the months that followed drew on text messages, interviews with people close to the family, and documentation of prior contacts with law enforcement to build a portrait of the Haight household that stood in sharp contrast to its public image. According to that report, Michael Haight was described by multiple individuals with knowledge of the family's private dynamics as controlling, volatile, and deeply preoccupied with maintaining a facade of perfection. A man who, beneath the surface of his community participation and family involvement, had reportedly subjected his household to a pattern of behavior that had caused at least some of his children to express fear to their peers and to adults outside the home. As early as 2020, the Enoch Police Department had opened a child abuse investigation in connection with the Haight household, prompted by statements made by the eldest daughter Macy, who had been 17 at the time of her death, That investigation had not resulted in prosecution, but the record of it existed and would later be scrutinized intensely by investigators and community members trying to understand how the events of January 4th had been allowed to happen. In December of 2022, approximately 2 weeks before the tragedy, Tasha Haight had retained a divorce attorney and filed a formal petition for divorce from Michael on December 21st. She was served with his response to the divorce paperwork on December 27th. According to people close to Tasha, Michael had been staying in the basement of the family home following the filing, and the household was in a period of significant tension and transition. Home video footage obtained by investigators and later reviewed by journalists showed Michael Haight on the evening of January 3rd, the night before the family was found, telling his children he loved them, discussing the details of the impending divorce with Tasha, and telling the children that when they woke up the next day they could all go sledding together. The following morning, he took the lives of every person in that household, including himself. A suicide note recovered at the scene revealed that Michael Haight had framed his actions in terms of being unable to tolerate what he perceived as his wife's control over him. "I would rather rot in hell," he reportedly wrote, in a document that investigators noted stood in stark contradiction to the evidence of his own controlling and abusive behavior that the 57-page report had assembled. The bedding that had been placed over some of the victims suggested to investigators that the act had been planned in advance rather than carried out in a moment of sudden impulse. Google searches recovered from Michael's devices in the period leading up to January 4th further supported the conclusion that the events of that morning were not spontaneous. Because Michael Haight died by suicide, no criminal trial was held and no conviction was entered. The legal accountability that would normally follow such events was foreclosed by his own actions on the same morning. He took the lives of 7 other people. What followed instead was a wrongful death civil process and a broader community reckoning with the question of what had been visible, what had been reported, what had been investigated, and what had not been sufficient to protect Tasha, Gail, Macy, Briley, Ammon, Sienna, and Gavin from the man who had been entrusted with their safety. Tasha Haight was 40 years old. She had filed for divorce 2 weeks before she was taken from the world, trying to find a way to safety for herself and her children. Gail Earl was 78, visiting her daughter during a difficult time. Macy was 17. Briley was 12. Ammon and Sienna were 7. And Gavin was 4 years old, young enough that his understanding of the world was still being formed, trusting completely in the people around him, deserving of nothing less than a lifetime of protection from exactly the kind of harm that found him on the morning of January 4th, 2023.